Hi, class. Let's take a look at the cerebrum now. And remember, let's not confuse cerebrum with cerebellum. What we see here in green in the upper right, all of this is cerebrum. And there are different divisions of it. If you think back to osteology, you learned these different bones, like the frontal bone, the occipital bone, the temporal bone, the parietal bone. So all of those bones protect parts of the cerebrum. The frontal bone protects the frontal lobe. The occipital bone protects the occipital lobe. The parietal bone protects the parietal lobe, and the temporal bone protects the temporal lobe. So there are different sections and regions of the cerebrum. The outer part of the cerebrum is called the cortex or cerebral cortex, and the outer part is always gray. It's gray matter. So the cerebral cortex is gray matter, whereas the inner part of the brain is made up of white matter. The brain has like hills and valleys, hills and valleys. The hills are called gyri, and the valleys are called sulci or sulcus. So the hills are called gyri. That may make sense because we've learned of a precentral and postcentral gyrus. And the sulcus are these depressions or these valleys. Notice not quite as deep as a fissure. Notice the fissures are much deeper and the sulci are a little bit more shallow. Okay. I'll show you on the next slide a structure called the longitudinal fissure. That's an important fissure that separates the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, the right and left cerebral hemispheres. And in a previous video, I had shown you the corpus callosum, which is really a band of white matter that now connects the left and the right cerebral hemisphere together. So when we look here at the brain, we could see that we have these two hemispheres. We have a left and a right cerebral hemisphere, and right down the center is that longitudinal fissure. That's a pretty deep depression. Going across left to right, there's a sulcus. It's called the central sulcus. And that central sulcus is important because it separates the precentral from the postcentral gyrus. And the precentral gyrus is your primary motor area, and your postcentral gyrus is your primary sensory area. If we look at the brain from the sagittal view down below, you can see the central sulcus here, right there. That's the central sulcus. And then right in front of it is the precentral gyrus. That's your primary motor area. And just behind it is the postcentral gyrus, which is your primary sensory area. The postcentral gyrus is part of your parietal lobe, and your precentral gyrus is part of your frontal lobe. Back here, the green area, that's your occipital lobe. And then your purple area right here, that's your temporal lobe. So the cerebrum has four main parts to it. It's got your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and your temporal lobe. We have this green line going up and down. That is your longitudinal fissure. And then going across that way, that is your central sulcus, left to right. You can also see it down below, lighting up there. That's your central sulcus. I like this brain also because it shows the four primary areas of the cerebrum. In the pink, we see the frontal lobe. In the green, we see the occipital lobe. In the lavender or light purple, we see the parietal lobe. And then in the tannish color, we see the temporal lobe. We could see the central sulcus right here. The central sulcus is that clear delineation between your primary motor area, called the precentral gyrus, and the primary sensory area, which is the postcentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus is your primary motor area. Remember, this is where your homunculus is, which is that kind of very weird, distorted diagram of the person that has this like very large eyes, lips, tongue, fingers, hands, feet, and those areas that are highly sensitive are going to take up lots of neurons and neurological real estate in the brain. And those same parts of the body that are involved with type of precision, like moving the eyes, moving your pinky, moving your fingers just a little bit, are going to occupy lots of real estate in that post central gyrus. Your occipital lobe, remember this area here is your primary visual area. Your parietal lobe is your primarily dealing with your sensations to all of your body. Being able to identify that someone's touching your right shoulder or someone, or looking at your right ankle and knowing that it is a little bit swollen compared to your left ankle. That's all parietal lobe that does that. Your frontal lobe is dealing with mostly inhibition, to inhibit your behaviors. Your frontal lobe is also dealing with your ambition, your drive, your emotional state, if you're depressed, if you have OCDs, these are all frontal lobe. Anger management issues, part of the frontal lobe issues. A rapid heart rate in a baby is normal, and rapid breathing in a baby is normal because the frontal lobe hasn't fully developed to inhibit those activities, which is why a baby pees and poops in a diaper. They can't inhibit those activities. But when the frontal lobe starts to develop, the heart rate slows down. The breathing rate slows down. They don't poop in their pants anymore or pee in their pants. They know they have to go to the bathroom. They can tell their parents. So frontal lobe is a very, very important part of the brain. Your temporal lobe is going to deal with hearing and taste, and the occipital lobe primarily vision. We did the cerebellum already. We know that that deals with balance and equilibrium, and deals with blood pressure to the extremities by balancing out the parasympathetics, by inhibiting the sympathetics. And we spoke about the medulla and the pons and the midbrain. We also spoke about the cranial nerves that originate in all of these parts of the brain. We just didn't mention the cerebrum as of yet, which is only cranial nerves number 1 and cranial nerve number 2 that comes off of the cerebrum. Here is the corpus callosum. You can see these bands of white matter that connect left hemisphere to right hemisphere. So these two parts of the brain can talk to one another. And then you have these black lines. These are just projection fibers, of which one part of the brain on the same hemisphere can communicate with another part of the brain of the same hemisphere. So the brain has lots of neural networks that can talk to other centers of the brain on the same side or cross over to the opposite side. Okay, the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is a region of the brain that has connections to other parts that we have already mentioned. There are connections to the red nucleus, the substantia nigra, the hypothalamus. There's input and output to so many different parts of the brain. But what the basal ganglia is primarily known for, like its claim to fame, is dealing with large automatic movements of your skeletal muscles. So, like if you slip or lose your balance somewhere, you know how like your arm flings out and your left leg, your body moves automatically to try and restore balance. That's what the basal ganglia does. It's involved in what's called the righting reflex, to right and balance yourself. When there's damage to different nuclei and different parts of the basal ganglia, there are going to be also disorders, movement disorders when there's damage to different centers of the basal ganglia. And I'm not going to test you on these different centers, but if it was an advanced neurology class, then you'd have to know these different centers. Now, what we see here in green, this is referred to as the limbic system. The limbic system also has different parts to it. It has a parahippocampal, hippocampal. It's got so many different moving parts to it, a lot of different sections to it. But the limbic system, generally speaking, is what we refer to as your emotional brain. It's involved with intense pleasure, it's associated with intense pain. The stronger the sense of pleasure, the stronger the sense of pain, the stronger the emotion, the more effective and stronger the memory is going to be. Okay, strong emotions are going to increase the memory. And this is why you remember the funniest movie you ever saw, the movie that made you cry. You're going to remember those. You're going to remember your kindergarten teacher, your first grade teacher, any instructor or teacher that had some sort of emotional connection with you. You're going to remember them because they stimulated that limbic system. Whenever you hear the word uh, hippo or hippocampus or parahippocampus, these are involved with memories and strong memories. Okay. What we're looking at here now is if we look at the cerebral cortex, notice how there is different numbers here. Okay. And in the field of neurology, they have numbered different parts of the brain to indicate what their primary functions are. So if we look at areas 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3 right in here, that is your primary somatosensory area, which is the post central gyrus. If we look at number 17 back here, that's in the occipital lobe. That's your primary visual area. If we look at number 41 and 42 over here, that's in the temporal lobe. That's your primary auditory area. And just above it, right there, number 43, that's for taste. Gustatory means taste. When we look at the motor region, so now we look at the primary motor area, which is number 4. That's your pre-central gyrus. Number 4 is your pre-central gyrus. That is all motor, motor, motor. Whereas number 1, 2, and 3, that's your sensory area. That's your post-central gyrus. So number 4 is your primary motor area. And number 44, right here, that's a very, very important area called Broca's area. It's involved in the production of speech, and it's primarily found in the left hemisphere of the brain. So when there's a stroke or decreased blood supply to that left hemisphere of the brain, the chances of Broca's area being affected is very, very high. And this is why when people stroke out on the left side of the brain, they may lose motor control on the opposite side of the body, but their speech becomes affected. We've seen broadcasters or newscasters that are having strokes in process, and what happens is they just muffle all their words. They think they're making sense, but the connection isn't there. Okay, so when there's damage to Broca's area, they call that aphasia. Aphasia is without speech, the inability to communicate.
Professor, I have a question.
Please hold it for a second, please.
Okay.
So here is reviewing, here's the somatosensory area. Now, we know that 1, 2, and 3, right here, we know that that's the primary somatosensory, right? We know that postcentral gyrus is primary, but it's going to link and associate with other regions. So 1, 2, and 3 don't function by themselves. They're going to relate to 5 and 7. There's an association area. Anytime you see association, it's not the primary region, but it's going to work in conjunction. So, for example, the visual association area. Well, we know the primary area is number 17. That's primary. But the association area is 18 and 19, meaning when your eyes see an individual, the receptors of the eye can see the person. The eyeball, if you would, right? The eyeball is going to see the person. It's going to send the messages back here to the occipital lobe, to the primary visual area, but that just allows you to see the person. But now you're going to evaluate and go, who is that person? How do I know them? And that's what association areas are, is going to link up to say, oh, I know that individual. That was my instructor. So when you see these association areas, like the auditory association area, which is number 22, it's not your primary hearing center. The primary hearing center relays, right? Your primary auditory is this one, 42. But it allows you to hear a voice or hear a sound. But now it's going to relay it to a different area, to an association area, and you can go, oh, yeah, I recognize that song. I know who that singer is. Okay, so that's what these association areas are. You don't have to memorize these numbers by any means. The term aphasia that I mentioned before, this term aphasia, a means without. So there's different types of aphasia. One of them is called non-fluent aphasia, and this is the inability to properly form words. Okay, you know what you want to say, you just can't say it. And that's typically due to damage to Broca's area, which is number 44. That's non-fluent aphasia. When it's fluent aphasia, this is a faulty understanding of a spoken word or a faulty understanding of what you are reading. That's fluent aphasia. Now there's a faulty understanding of the spoken or written words. There's something called word deafness. Word deafness is an inability to understand the spoken word, and word blindness is an inability to understand what you just read. So you may read the word ball, but not know what a ball is. You can hear the word ball and not understand what that word is. At one point in your life, you did, but when there's damage to these centers, especially these integrative association areas, it's the processing of that. You can't process it and interpret that information. When we come back, we'll get into hemispheric lateralization, which is the different hemispheres and what those functions are.